For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's best friend. Every single night, millions of families let him into their living rooms. He made them laugh, he made them smile, and he said goodnight to an entire country with his famous goodbye, Dad. Here's what's going to surprise you about the man everyone thought they knew. When those cameras stopped working, when that famous curtain finally closed, Johnny Carson became one of the loneliest people in America. The king of late night, the man who could make anyone laugh, who helped start careers with a single hand. Movement spent his final 13 years like a ghost in his own life. You're about to find out how the most loved man on television died almost completely alone. How his own son's sad death broke him in ways the public never saw. Why his closest friends were cut off forever over fights he couldn't let go. This isn't the Johnny Carson story you think you know. This is the story of how being famous became a jail, and how the walls meant to protect him became the bars that trapped him until his final breath. Johnny Carson wasn't born to be the king of comedy. He was made by loneliness, shaped by being turned away, and formed by a childhood so cold it would haunt him for the rest of his life. It all started in the small town of Norfolk, Nebraska, where a shy boy who loved books named John William Carson learned his first and most important lesson. Never let anyone see the real you. His mother, Ruth Carson, was the kind of woman who could freeze a room with a single look. Cold, mean, and emotionally far away. She treated love like something expensive she couldn't afford to give, no matter what Johnny did. Good grades, successful magic shows. Being the perfect, well-behaved child, he never felt like he could win her approval. Years later, when Ruth died, Johnny made a choice that would surprise everyone who knew him. He didn't go to her funeral. Instead, he told his lawyer something that showed how deep that childhood hurt was. He called her a wicked witch. Young Johnny found magic tricks. Magic gave Johnny something he really wanted, the ability to connect with people without being emotionally hurt. He could perform, get laughs, win approval, all while hiding behind tricks and illusions. The real Johnny stayed safely locked away. His father, Homer, wasn't mean like Ruth, but he might as well have been invisible. Johnny learned early that the adults in his life couldn't be counted on for warmth or connection. So, the boy did what survivors do. He got used to it. He built walls, He learned to be charming from far away, to entertain without showing who he really was, To make people laugh without letting them in. In 1962, at just 36 years old, Johnny Carson walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show and claimed a throne he would sit on for 3 decades. But here's what nobody understood at the time. He wasn't just becoming a TV host. He was disappearing behind the most successful mask in entertainment history. The genius of Johnny Carson wasn't just his timing or his smartness. It was his ability to make 20 million people feel like his best friend while never letting a single person actually know him. Johnny had a rule that he would never meet his guests before they walked through that famous curtain. The official reason: he wanted every reaction on camera to be real. But the real reason was much darker. It was how he lived his entire life. Even with people he worked with every single day, Johnny kept that wall firmly in place. His staff members, people who spent decades by his side, would later admit something that should chill you to the bone. They never really knew him. Ed McMahon, the man who sat next to Johnny for 30 years, once saw that Johnny was great with millions of people, but terrible with just a few close relationships. That same emotional distance that made him terrible at relationships made him absolutely brilliant on television. The power he built up was amazing. Taz peak, NBC was making over $55 million a year from his show. With a single hand movement, calling a comedian over to the couch after their act, Johnny could launch a career into the stars. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Jerry Seinfeld, Joan Rivers. They all owed their success to one good night on his stage. But here's what's truly sad. The more successful he became, the more alone he felt. Fame should have filled the empty space left by his cold Nebraska childhood. Instead, it made that empty space deeper and darker. Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and every single marriage followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Passion in the beginning, emotional distance in the middle, and devastating collapse at the end. But here's what's going to surprise you about his love life. It wasn't that he couldn't love. It's that he was scared of being loved back. His first marriage to college sweetheart, Jody Walcott, lasted 15 years and gave him 3 sons. But even then, friends could see the cracks. Johnny was already showing the same emotional distance he'd learned as a child. He provided for his family with money, but couldn't give them what they needed most, himself. His third marriage showed just how deep his emotional damage was. Joanna Holland was a former model, beautiful and patient. For 10 years, she tried to crack the code of Johnny Carson's heart. And then, on their 10th wedding anniversary, she did something that surprised everyone, including Johnny himself. During what should have been a celebration dinner, Joanna handed him divorce papers. The divorce cost Johnny over $20 million, a record-breaking settlement at the time. But here's the thing that's going to break your heart. Even after 4 marriages, even after decades of trying and failing at love, Johnny never learned how to let someone in. And then there were his children, 3 sons who should have been the most important people in his life, but who instead became victims of his emotional distance. Christopher and Corey, his older sons, learned to accept their father's limitations. But his youngest son, Rick, was different. Rick was creative like his father, sensitive, and desperately in need of connection. He struggled with depression, with substance abuse, with the weight of being Johnny Carson's son, while never really knowing Johnny Carson, the father. June 21st, 1991. It was supposed to be just another day, but it became the day that changed everything for Johnny Carson. The day his emotional walls couldn't protect him from the one thing he feared most. Real, devastating, uncontrollable pain. His youngest son, Rick, was driving along a coastal highway in California. He was 39 years old, a nature photographer, who found peace behind a camera lens. Rick had struggled for years with depression and substance abuse. The weight of being Johnny Carson's son, combined with a father who couldn't connect emotionally, had taken its toll. The car fell 125 feet down a steep hill. Rick Carson was killed instantly. When Johnny got the call, something inside him broke. For the first time in his adult life, the walls he'd built couldn't keep out the pain. This wasn't a failed marriage he could walk away from, or a business fight he could control. This was his child, and he was gone forever. He took 4 weeks off from The Tonight Show, an unprecedented break for a man who had rarely missed a single night in 30 years. But here's what's going to break your heart. Even in his deepest sadness, even facing the worst tragedy a parent can experience, Johnny Carson couldn't let people in. He refused to go to Rick's memorial service, reportedly to keep it from becoming a media circus. Even his son's death couldn't break down the walls it's been a lifetime building. But Rick's death wasn't the only thing pushing Johnny deeper into being alone. There was another pattern in his life that was making his world smaller and smaller. Every day, his ability to hold grudges that lasted forever. And nobody learned this lesson more painfully than Joan Rivers. For years, Joan had been Johnny's favorite, his most trusted guest host, and what many considered his closest friend in the business. In 1986, Fox offered Joan her own late-night show. But there was a problem. She was afraid to tell Johnny about it, so she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took the deal without telling him first. When Johnny found out through someone else, he felt completely and utterly betrayed. Joan tried to call him to explain, but he wouldn't take her call. And then Johnny Carson did what Johnny Carson always did when he felt betrayed. He erased her from his life completely. He didn't just stop speaking to Joan Rivers. He banned her from The Tonight Show for the rest of his time as host. Her name was forbidden. The consequences were devastating. Joan's show on Fox struggled, partly because Carson allegedly pressured guests not to appear on it. The show was canceled after just over a year. Her husband Edgar, who took the blame for the show's failure, took his own life a few months later. Joan tried desperately to reach out to Johnny. She called. She wrote letters. Nothing worked. The door was locked forever. By the time he announced his retirement in 1991, Johnny Carson had built himself a fortress of being alone. The death of his son had devastated him. His grudges had cost him friendships, and his emotional walls had grown so high that almost nobody could reach him anymore. On May 22, 1992, 50 million Americans watched Johnny Carson say goodbye to The Tonight Show. It was one of the most watched television events in history. But what happened next would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. Johnny Carson didn't just retire from television. He disappeared from the world completely. Everyone expected a gradual fade. Maybe some guest appearances, hosting the Oscars, a few primetime specials. What they got instead was absolute silence. Johnny turned down every single interview request, every tribute, every public appearance. He went back to his massive clifftop mansion in Malibu, beautiful fortress overlooking the Pacific Ocean, for the millions who had watched him every night for 3 decades. Johnny Carson essentially stopped existing. The being alone that Johnny chose was also a kind of prison. He had spent his entire adult life being Johnny Carson, a public character that required immense control to maintain. In retirement, he no longer had the nightly release of the show, which left him alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and his ghosts. Rick's death was still an unspoken sorrow that haunted him every day. The grudges he held, like the one against Joan Rivers, were never fixed, leaving wounds to get worse in the silence. He had built his life like a fortress to keep the world out, but in his final years, he found himself trapped inside it, and then his body began to show what was happening to his spirit. Johnny had been a heavy smoker for most of his life. He had quit in the 1970s, but the damage was already done. In September 2002, the news broke that he had been diagnosed with emphysema, progressive and brutal lung disease that slowly steals your breath. But the emphysema was winning. The disease got worse. Johnny's world shrank even more. The man who had once commanded a stage in front of millions was now trapped at home. On the morning of January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was breathing failure due to emphysema. He was 79 years old. His wife Alexis was by his side, but beyond that small circle. He died as he had lived his final 13 years in deep being alone. True to his lifelong need for privacy, there was no public memorial service. The man who had lived in the public eye for 3 decades was laid to rest in complete secrecy. The contrast was amazing. 50 million people had watched him leave television, but only a handful saw him leave this world. When news of his death broke, tributes poured in from around the world. President Bush issued a statement. Jay Leno called him the gold standard of television. David Letterman gave perhaps the most moving tribute, saying that all who came after Carson were pretenders and that no one would ever match his achievement. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from understanding what Johnny Carson's story really represents. He was a master of making people feel less alone.